She didn't beg. That's the part nobody talks about. When Alpha King Kyle Draven stood before his entire kingdom and called his Luna a traitor, she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She lifted her chin, let him strip the mark from her neck in front of 1,000 witnesses, and walked into the frozen north alone. No coat, no supplies, no goodbye. The kingdom thought she was broken. The kingdom was wrong. Stay with me until the end, because this story will wreck you in the best possible way. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching this. The throne room of Silverfang Keep had been built to intimidate. Every slab of black granite in its floor had been quarried from the iron marches, hauled north by 1,000 hands across 3 brutal winters, and laid down by craftsmen who understood that power required a physical language, something cold beneath the boots, something vast above the head, something that made a person feel small the moment they crossed the threshold. The pillars ran floor to ceiling like rib cages, carved with wolves mid-howl, their stone mouths open and permanent. Torchlight threw their shadows long across the walls so that at any given hour the room appeared populated by creatures that didn't exist in daylight. Celine Vane had walked this floor 100 times without flinching. She was flinching now. Not visibly. Her spine was iron, her jaw was locked, and the expression on her face had been hammered into stillness by the last 48 hours of her life. But inside, under the sternum, something was tearing slowly. The kind of tear that doesn't bleed immediately. The kind you only feel later, alone, when the body finally understands what the mind refused to accept in real time. The room was full. That was the detail that kept surfacing in her thoughts, intrusive and awful. He had filled the room. Every pack elder, every warrior captain, every noble bloodline that held territory under the Silverfang banner, all of them standing in their winter furs and their silver-threaded collars, watching her stand alone at the center of the floor without an escort, without a second. She'd been summoned at dawn, not invited, not informed. Summoned the way you summon a lesser creature, and brought here by 2 guards who would not meet her eyes. Kael stood on the raised platform at the far end of the room. He was, objectively, the most physically commanding man she had ever been near. That had never changed, and she doubted it would, even now, even here. 6'4" of lean wolf muscle and old bloodline authority, with the kind of bone structure that looked like it had been assembled specifically to make lesser men feel inadequate. Black hair, jaw like a fist, eyes the precise color of a winter sky at the moment before a storm committed to itself. That gray that wasn't quite gray, that blue that wasn't quite blue, that color that existed only in the transition between one thing and another. He wore no crown. He never wore the crown except at formal investitures. He didn't need it. The crown was just decoration. Kael Draven's authority lived in his stillness. He was very still now. Celine had loved that stillness once, had read safety into it, had learned the specific weight of his silences and what each variation meant. She had believed for 3 years that she could hear his moods the way a skilled tracker reads snow, by pressure and absence, by what was disturbed and what was left untouched. She understood now that she had been reading a surface, that the interior had always been closed to her. Lady Seraphine stood 3 steps behind his left shoulder. Celine made herself look at her. It was the kind of discipline that costs something, the act of forcing your eyes toward the thing that hurts most, but she owed it to herself. Seraphine was tall, copper-haired, constructed with the deliberate aesthetic precision of a woman who had always known she was being watched. Her gown was deep burgundy, not an accident, that choice of color in a room where Celine stood pale and summoned and stripped of preparation. Her hand rested at the arch of her collarbone as though she were in the middle of a private moment of thought, and her expression was arranged into something that looked almost like reluctant sorrow. Celine had seen better performances. She had also seen worse. "Celine Vane!" Kael's voice came down from the platform like weather. Even now, even in this specific hell, the sound of it registered in her chest before it reached her ears. Deep, controlled, the bass note of a man who had learned young that volume was amateur, that the truly dangerous voice was the quiet one. "You stand before the Pack Council on charges of collusion with the Iron Maw faction. specifically providing information regarding Silverfang patrol routes and supply schedules to persons acting against the Pack's interests. The silence after that had a texture. It pressed against her eardrums. "I want to hear you say it," she said. A ripple moved through the assembled crowd. One of the elders, old Marin, Pack historian, gray-braided and severe, shifted her weight. Kale's eyes didn't change. "Say what?" "That you believe it, that you're standing there on that platform in front of everyone who matters in this kingdom, and you actually believe I did this." Celine's voice came out level. She was surprised. She hadn't been certain it would. "Because you owe me that, at minimum. Not a charge, not a council procedure. You standing there, looking at me and saying out loud that you think I betrayed this pack. The evidence is what I'm asking about. Not the evidence. You." She took one step toward the platform. The guards on either side of the room moved, but Kael raised 2 fingers and they stopped. She kept going. 3 years, Kael. I've slept in your bed and run your household and stood beside you at every table where the future of this pack was decided. I've been in the room for every treaty, every blood price negotiation, every brutal decision you've made that kept Silverfang alive through 2 of the worst winters in a generation. And you're telling me that based on evidence you won't show me, after a conversation I wasn't invited to, you believe I sold patrol routes to Ironmaw. You were seen. His jaw was tight. At the border crossing near Ashvale, by 2 separate witnesses. Then bring them here. Let me look at them. Celine, bring them here. Her voice cracked on it, just barely, just at the edge, and she hated herself for that crack but refused to let it spread. Bring your witnesses into this room and let me face them. That's how this works. That's the law you wrote. Something moved across his face. Guilt, maybe. Or the nearest thing to guilt that a man like Cale Draven would admit to in public. It was there and then gone, replaced by the stonewall expression she recognized now as what he wore when he'd already made a decision and was managing the presentation of it. "The witnesses have given formal testimony before the council," he said. "The council reviewed it and found it credible." "The council?" She looked at the room. Rows of faces, most of them carefully arranged into expressions of judicial neutrality. Old Marin was looking at the floor. "The council that wasn't told about Seraphine's arrival until 2 days after she was already in residence? That council? That's not relevant. It's entirely relevant. Celine." His voice dropped lower, and lower was worse. Lower meant the real conversation, the one that wasn't for the room. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." She stared at him, and in the 5 full seconds that followed, she felt something go quiet inside her that had been making noise for months. A low, constant frequency of hope, of effort, of trying. The sound of someone still believing in something. She felt it stop. "You've already decided," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Then stop performing a trial." She straightened, squared her shoulders, and did the thing that she understood in that moment would be the one thing no one in this room could take from her. She refused to beg. Not a word of it. Not a syllable. "If you're going to exile me, exile me. Don't dress it up in testimony and counsels and formal charges. Just say it." Cale Draven looked at her for a long time. Across the platform, behind his left shoulder, Seraphine's hand was still resting at her collarbone, and her expression was still arranged into that careful sorrow, and if anyone in the room was watching her closely enough, they might have noticed that her fingers were very slightly curling, pressing into her own skin, as though suppressing something. Nobody in the room was watching her closely enough. "By the authority of the Alpha King," Kael said, "and by the vote of the Pack Council, you are hereby stripped of the title of Luna and exiled from Silverfang territory, effective immediately. You have until sundown to collect your personal effects. You will be escorted to the northern border and released. You will not return." The throne room didn't gasp. That would have required them to forget for a moment that they were professionals, that they were elders and captains and nobles who had survived their own versions of this. But the silence shifted in quality. It became the silence of a room that had witnessed something irreversible. Celine turned around and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Seraphine say something, low, meant for Kael alone, meant to be private. She didn't catch the words. Later, she would turn this moment over and over in memory, examining it for the hidden shape of what was already in motion, the way you press a bruise to understand its edges. She didn't look back. The guards fell into step on either side of her, and they were at least decent enough not to touch her, and she walked out of the throne room of Silver Fang Keep under her own power, through the great doors and down the corridor of carved stone, and she did not stop until she reached the chamber that had been hers for 3 years. The Luna's rooms, the ones she'd furnished herself, the ones with the north-facing window that showed the tree line in winter. She closed the door behind her, stood there in the silence for 30 seconds. Then she started packing. She had until sundown. But there was a particular cruelty in being given time. If they'd thrown her out immediately, she would have had the momentum of the shock carrying her. Instead, they gave her 4 hours, which was enough time to feel everything twice. First the numbness, then the thing underneath the numbness that didn't have a clean name. That combination of humiliation and grief and something colder, something that was already past the softer emotions and into the territory of calculation. Celine packed efficiently. She'd grown up in the Eastern Marches, daughter of a border captain who'd raised her to understand that sentimentality had its season, and its season was not active crisis. She took what was functional, her winter gear, her boots, her kit knife, and the smaller blade she kept at her ankle, dried provisions from the storage chest in the attached antechamber, the traveling satchel she'd maintained as a habit, even after 3 years of comfort had made it seem paranoid. She did not take the Luna's seal. She left it on the desk. She didn't throw it anywhere or make a gesture of it. She just didn't take it. She did take the journal, the plain leather one, because it had her handwriting in it, and her handwriting was hers, and no charge of treason could strip her of her own thoughts. The knock came when she was 2 hours in, still an hour from sundown. "Come." The door opened and Mira entered. 17, Celine's personal attendant, dark-eyed and shaking in a way she was clearly trying to hide. Mira had been assigned to Celine's household 6 months ago, and in that 6 months she had grown from a nervous girl who knocked over serving trays into a competent, perceptive young woman who noticed things and kept her mouth closed about what she noticed. Celine had been quietly proud of her. "They told me," Mira started, and then stopped because her voice had cracked completely, and she was working to get it back. "I know what they told you. Luna, don't." Celine said it quietly. "That title doesn't belong to me anymore. You can call me by my name." Mira crossed the room in 3 steps and gripped Celine's wrist with both hands. Young hands, strong fingers, the grip of someone who had been raised doing physical work before she'd been elevated to household service. "You didn't do it," Mira said. Not a question. "No." "They know that." Her voice dropped to something fierce and private. "Some of them know. Elder Konak, he argued against it in the council session. I heard him arguing in the corridor before—" She stopped, swallowed. "I'm not supposed to tell you that." "Then you shouldn't have." But Celine gripped her hand back briefly. "Is there something specific you came to tell me? Or did you come to say goodbye?" Mira released her wrist and reached into the pocket of her apron. She produced a small oilskin packet tied with cord and held it out. Dried wolfsbane root, not the poison variety, the medicinal grade, for fever, for infection, the northern territories. She stopped again. "The northern territories are cold." Celine looked at the packet, then at Mira. "You're going to get in trouble for this." "I'll say I didn't know what was in the packet. I'll say I thought it was dried herbs for cooking." Mira's chin was up. "Take it." Celine took it, tucked it into the satchel without ceremony, because ceremony would have broken something, and the thing that was still intact inside her needed to stay intact for at least another few hours. "Go back to your duties," she said. "Find a different position in the household. Don't make yourself conspicuous. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Good." She turned back to the satchel. "Close the door on your way out." Tst. Sundown was a thin red line above the tree line when the guards came for her. 4 of them, captains by their insignia, which was both an insult and a recognition. They'd sent actual ranking warriors to escort her, not foot soldiers, which meant someone in the command structure had enough residual respect for what she'd been to ensure she wasn't humiliated by the handling of her departure. It was a small thing, she noticed it anyway. "Ready?" the lead captain said. Revik, she remembered, had served on Silverfang's eastern garrison before his promotion, had stood in her dining room on 3 separate occasions and eaten her food. "No," she said. "But let's go." She carried her own satchel. They didn't offer to help, and she wouldn't have let them. The walk through the keep was not designed to be witnessed, but it was witnessed anyway, because word had spread, and because people are what they are: curious, uncertain, guilty, and displaying that guilt as staring. Corridor after corridor, faces she recognized, faces that belonged to her 3-year chapter of this place. Most of them looked away. A few didn't. She did not grade them on this. She filed it in the cold storage at the back of her mind, where she was beginning to compile a very specific inventory. They passed through the great hall and out the main entrance into the courtyard, where the evening was already dropping temperature at a pace that meant real cold by midnight. The cobblestones were icy at the edges. She could see her breath. Kyle was not there. She hadn't expected him. She'd told herself she hadn't expected him. She noticed anyway, with that precise interior honesty she'd always maintained against her own preferences, that she had still, in some inaccessible region of herself, held a small possibility that he might be standing in the courtyard. That he might have found in the hours between the throne room and sundown something that changed the shape of what was happening. He was not there. Seraphine was not there either, which was probably wise. They went through the outer gate, down the switchback road carved into the hill, across the lower town where the pack's civilian population lived their civilian lives in the warm-lit windows, the smell of evening fires and cooking, children's voices somewhere behind a wall. Celine walked through it all with her face forward and her pace steady, and she did not think about how warm those windows looked. The northern border of Silverfang territory was marked by a series of stone posts, each carved with the pack's sigil, spaced at intervals through the tree line. Beyond them, the forest changed character. Denser, older, the trees wider spaced but larger, their canopy heavy enough that the remaining light barely penetrated. Beyond that forest, the maps identified terrain as unclassified northern expanse, which was the formal cartographic way of writing. Here, there is nothing useful. They stopped at the first post. "This is as far as we go," Revik said. Celine looked at the tree line, then at him. "I know. You should—" He stopped, tried again. "The nearest settlement to the north is Vel's Crossing, 7 days on foot, if the weather holds." She hadn't known that. She stored it. "Thank you." He looked like he wanted to say something else. Like there was a sentence sitting behind his teeth that he'd decided, in the end, not to let out. She didn't push. She adjusted the strap of her satchel, turned to face the trees, and walked past the stone post. The cold hit her immediately. Not worse cold, not dramatically different from the courtyard, but different in quality. Frontier cold, which is its own category. The cold that has no human structure in it, no walls to break it, no bodies sharing space to push it back. Just cold, flat, and continuous, belonging entirely to itself. She walked. The first 3 days were survival arithmetic. She had provisions enough for 4, if she was careful. She was careful. She had water from the snowmelt where the ground was still running under the ice, had fire from the kit she carried, had shelter from the knowledge she'd accumulated over years of working alongside hunters and trackers who'd spent their whole lives navigating terrain exactly like this. She had, more pressingly, the specific quality of cold anger that is the cleanest fuel available to human or wolf. Not hot anger. Hot anger burns fast and eats the person carrying it, demands action before there is anything useful to do with it, consumes clarity in favor of forward motion. Hot anger was what she'd felt in the throne room, briefly, before it had transmuted into something harder and lower and more durable. What she carried now was the cold version, the kind that doesn't demand, that doesn't require anything immediate, that simply maintains itself at a low, precise temperature and waits for the moment when there is actually something useful to do. She thought about Seraphine as she walked, tried to reconstruct the last several months with the new information written in, tried to understand the architecture of it. How long had the manipulation been running? At what point had Kael's suspicion towards Celine been first seeded, and by what mechanism? The answer to these questions mattered. Not because they would change what had already happened, but because the answers would tell her what Seraphine was, which would tell her what Seraphine would do next. Because whatever else was true, this was also true. She had been watching Seraphine for months, and what she had seen was not a woman in love. What she had seen was a woman with an agenda, performing love with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the part. The second night, she found a hollow in a rock formation that broke the wind and made a fire possible, and she sat by it longer than the fuel budget strictly allowed because she needed the stillness. She thought about Kyle. She'd loved him. She was honest enough to maintain that even now, even in a northern forest with her exile 3 days behind her and nothing ahead but uncertainty, she had loved him with the particular intensity of someone who doesn't love easily, who kept their interior carefully maintained, who had finally found in one person the thing that was worth opening the gate for. She had loved his ferocity and his intelligence and the rare occasions when the public armor came down and she saw the person underneath, the one who had been shaped by violence and loss into something hard but not broken, the one who'd taken the inheritance of a pack at war and held it together through sheer force of competent will. She had also, she understood now, constructed a version of him that was slightly better than the truth. She had filled his silences with a generosity they may not have deserved, had attributed to his reserve qualities of depth that may have been, in reality, qualities of distance. She had loved him. She had also needed him to be worth loving. The fire cracked and settled, and she let that thought sit without dressing it up in anything. He had chosen to believe the evidence rather than the woman. He'd had 3 years of data, and he'd discarded it for testimony he hadn't let her face. That was what it was. She could hold it without melodrama or self-pity. She could hold it and still love him. Both things true at the same time, both things present in the same chest, neither one canceling the other. What she refused to feel was broken. She had run routes in the Eastern Marches at 17 with her father's garrison. She had negotiated pact treaties with men twice her age and 3 times her territory. She had stood in Kyle's war room during the Iron Maw incursions and argued strategic positions that later proved correct. She had done all of this. And she would still be all of this, with or without the title they'd stripped and the man who'd stripped it. She closed her eyes, opened them when the fire had dropped to coals, and the cold had asserted itself in the hollow with quiet authority. Day 4. Dutton. The discovery happened on day 6, approximately 2 hours before she would have reached Vell's crossing. She'd been paralleling a ridgeline that gave her an elevated view of the approach, which was simply good habits. Visibility before descent, check the terrain before you enter it. From the ridge, she could see the trade road running northeast, could see the smoke of the settlement, could see the day's activity along the road, could also see, because she had trained herself over years to see things she wasn't necessarily meant to see. The 2 wagons stopped in the tree cover approximately a quarter-mile south of the settlement's perimeter, off-road, covered by canvas that had been draped in a specific pattern over specific shapes. She'd seen shapes like that before, in Silver Fang's supply operations. She stayed on the ridge and watched for 40 minutes, long enough to see the 3 figures who moved between the wagons and the trees, who spoke with the tight economy of people conducting business. They needed to conclude quickly. Long enough to see the handoff. Cases moved from the wagons to a pack horse. The pack horse led north by a person in civilian clothes, one of the wagon figures producing something that caught the light and passing it to another. Long enough to recognize in the posture and the movement and the specific way that one of the figures tilted their head while receiving information, a gesture she had seen performed in a different context, in a warm room with firelight, in the residence of a woman who had spent months working very carefully to never be seen at all. She was not certain. She needed to be certain. She came down from the ridge in a different path than she'd been traveling, wide around the south side, coming in through the undergrowth to a position that put her 20 yards from the wagons with a clear sightline and the wind at her back. The figure who moved like Seraphine had already departed, but the third figure was still there, loading canvas, and Celine watched him until he turned and she saw his face. And the face she saw was a face she knew from a different context entirely. A name she had heard in Iron Maw intelligence briefings. A name that appeared in documents that had been marked restricted. A a name that belonged to a logistics coordinator for an entity that was most definitely not a civilian trading operation. She stayed absolutely still while the third figure finished loading and climbed onto the wagon seat and clicked the horses north. The wagon moved past her position at 20 yards. She counted 25 seconds until the sound of the wheels faded. Then she moved. To the spot where the wagons had been parked, where the packed snow held impressions, if you knew how to read them, where the ground had been disturbed by the weight of the cases that had been transferred. She crouched and examined the impressions and found what she was looking for in the debris the operation had left behind. A single glass vial, small enough to sit in a palm, with the stopper still in it, with approximately a quarter-inch of residue at the bottom, with a specific amber-yellow quality to that residue that she recognized because she'd spent 3 years managing Silver Fang's supply operations, and she had been shown, during the course of that work, exactly what certain poisons looked like in their raw state before they were processed into forms suitable for distribution. She held the vial in her cold fingers and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened her satchel, wrapped the vial in cloth, and stowed it in the inner pocket against her chest, where it would be protected by body heat from the temperature that would shatter the glass. She sat back on her heels in the snow of the northern wilds, exiled and alone, with the beginning of something in her hand, and she felt the cold anger in her chest recalibrate slightly. Not grow hotter, just shift, sharpen, find its edge. She had been sent out here to disappear. She was reconsidering that option. Vels Crossing was a frontier settlement in the specific sense that all the romance of that word had been stripped out of it by the practical business of actually being on a frontier. It was functional. It had walls, a market, a tavern that tripled as an inn and community hall, a healer's operation that was also the settlement's only medical facility, and a population of approximately 300 that skewed heavily toward people who'd had, at some point, a reason to put distance between themselves and the established pack territories. Celine spent 2 days there, long enough to resupply, to sleep in a bed, to pay for information in the market economy of small settlement gossip. What she learned in 2 days at Vels Crossing troubled her enough that she didn't sleep well the second night. The rumors filtering north from the Silver Fang territories were specific and consistent. Warriors falling sick without apparent injury. Children in the eastern holds coming down with a fever that didn't respond normally to treatment. An elder of the Western Sept who had been in perfect health dead within a week of the solstice ceremony. The stories had the texture of things that were being passed from mouth to mouth because the people passing them didn't know what to do with them. Too strange for normal gossip. Too frightening for idle conversation. She sat in the tavern's corner with a cup of something warm and thought about amber-yellow residue and glass vials and the spacing of the symptoms as she'd heard them described, and the shape of what she was thinking was ugly enough that she almost rejected it twice before accepting it. She had, against her preference, one other piece of information. In the market on the first day, she had purchased dried provisions from an older woman who ran a supply stall. During the transaction, because old women running supply stalls in frontier settlements often know things because they see the same people come and go, she had asked, carefully, whether any unusual traffic had come through in the past few months. The old woman had said, in the way that people say things when they want credit for saying them, that there'd been a lot more courier traffic than usual on the northern routes. Pack seals she didn't recognize. Consignments that nobody explained. She had asked, even more carefully, whether any of those consignments had been bound for settlements in the Silver Fang territories. The old woman had looked at her with the specific wariness of a person deciding whether to talk, and then she'd said, yes, several. Supply goods, supposedly. But the seals on those consignments matched none of the legitimate Silver Fang supply chains she'd ever seen. Celine had paid for her provisions and walked away from the stall and stood in the cold market air for a moment with her hands at her sides and understood, fully, what she was holding. Not just evidence of Seraphine's external dealings, evidence of an active operation, a distribution network, something that had been running for months, that had access to Silver Fang supply chains through channels that bypassed official oversight, that was introducing materials into a pack's food and resource systems that were producing deaths and illness in a pattern too specific to be coincidence. Her pack. Her people. The people who had stood in that throne room and watched her be exiled, yes. And some of them had looked at the floor and some of them hadn't. And not one of them had stood up in the open and said, wait. but they were still her people in the way that the word means something beyond gratitude and choice. The people she had spent 3 years working to protect, the children she had overseen aid programs for, the warriors she had sat beside at treaty tables, the elders whose names she knew and whose histories she'd memorized because knowing the people was the minimum requirement of leadership. She was alone in a frontier tavern, with evidence in her chest pocket and the sound of 300 miles of winter territory between herself and anything she could do about it. She thought about going back. She thought about what going back would look like. Returning to packed territory with nothing but a glass vial and a story, trying to walk into Silverfang Keep through the authority of a title she'd been stripped of, trying to make Kyle hear her when Kyle had already decided, trying to circumvent Seraphine's access to the man's judgment when she didn't yet know the full architecture of that access or how deep it went. She thought about waiting, about gathering more evidence, about building a case that was dense enough to withstand the defense that Seraphine would mount the moment she knew Celine was alive and moving. The decision space between those options was narrow and uncomfortable, and she sat in it for the rest of the second night, in the corner of a frontier tavern in Vell's Crossing, alone with the amber-yellow vial against her chest and 300 miles of winter between herself and the only thing in the world that still mattered to her. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it working at the shutters. She put her cup down and opened her journal to a blank page and began to write. Names, dates, the specific pattern of the illness reports, the logistics route she'd inferred from the wagon positions, the face she'd recognized, the vial in her pocket, the courier traffic from the old woman in the market. She wrote it all in the cramped, precise shorthand she'd developed for sensitive documentation, the kind that wouldn't yield its meaning quickly to anyone who found it and didn't know the code. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she closed the journal and sat in the dark and listened to the wind. 300 miles. She needed more. Not just the vial. Anyone could say the vial was planted, could construct a story around it, could use her exile itself as evidence of her motivation to fabricate. She needed the source. She needed the chain. She needed to put the name at the top of the chain into the same room with evidence that couldn't be dismissed, and she needed to do it in front of witnesses who had the authority to matter. That was going to take time. Time she was not certain the Silverfang pack had. She pressed her back against the tavern wall and made herself think about Kyle. Not the man in the throne room making the decision that had destroyed 3 years of her life, but the man 2 years ago in the war room at 4 a.m. when the Iron Maw incursion had been at its worst, sitting across the table from her in silence after she'd laid out the strategic analysis, and then saying, in the quiet voice that wasn't for public use, "You see things I don't. I don't know how to tell you to stop doing that. I need it." The man who had said that, who had trusted her with things no one else in the kingdom had been trusted with, that man was still in the keep. Under everything Seraphine had built around him, under the testimony and the exile and the decisions already made, that man was still there, probably. She had to believe probably was enough. She closed her eyes, opened them when she heard, muffled but distinct through the tavern wall, the sound of horses arriving in the night. Multiple horses, moving fast, not the pace of travel, but the pace of pursuit. And she was on her feet with her hand on her kit knife before the thought had fully assembled, moving to the shutter and pressing her eye to the gap, and seeing in the torchlight of Vell's Crossing's central road 3 riders with the Silverfang seal on their chest armor, pulling up hard at the settlement entrance. And then the second detail, the one that made the cold anger in her chest drop to something different, something that was closer to fear and colder than anger. The 4th rider coming in behind the first 3 was Revik, the captain who had escorted her to the border and told her the settlement was 7 days north. He wasn't looking for her. She could see from the set of his body that he wasn't here for her. He was here running from something. And then the 4th rider fell from his horse. Revik Wub, Silverfang captain, ranking warrior, man who had stood in her dining room on 3 separate occasions, hit the frozen road of Vell's Crossing and did not get up. And even from the shutter gap, she could see the quality of the stillness with which he lay, and she understood in the 15 seconds before anyone outside moved that he had ridden 7 days north to the only settlement he knew was in Celine Vane's direction, and that he had not made it. The other 3 riders were already dismounting, shouting for a healer. Celine took her hand off the knife, looked at the journal on the table, looked at the vile outline against her ribs. Thought, 7 days in the other direction. Thought, whatever just happened to Revik happened inside Silverfang territory. Thought, I am out of time. Revik didn't die that night. That was the first surprise. The healer at Vel's Crossing was a compact, gray-haired woman named Doss, who moved through emergencies the way experienced people move, without theater, without wasted steps, with the particular economy of someone who had seen enough bad outcomes to know that speed and calm were not opposites. She worked on Revik for 2 hours in the back room of the tavern, while Celine sat in the corner of the main hall and watched the other 3 riders drink and not talk about what had happened. She watched them the way she had learned to watch things, without appearing to watch, her gaze loose, her attention underneath the surface of her posture. They were Silverfang warriors, young, road-worn, carrying the specific exhaustion of people who had been moving fast for days under conditions that hadn't improved. 2 men and a woman. The woman had a cut along her forearm that had been wrapped with cloth and not properly treated, and every so often she looked at it the way people look at things they're pretending don't concern them. At the 40-minute mark, one of the men looked up from his cup and found Celine's eyes across the room. He looked away, then back. The recognition moved across his face slowly, then fast, the way a fire catches. She didn't move. He leaned toward the others and said something low. Both of them looked. The woman's jaw tightened. Celine put her cup down and crossed the room and sat across from them before any of them could decide what to do with what they were thinking. "Tell me what happened," she said. The first man, broad-shouldered, maybe 25, a scar through his left eyebrow that was old enough to have faded, said nothing. "You rode 7 days north in the wrong season," she said. "Revik is in a back room right now with a healer, and I don't know yet if he'll make it through the night. Whatever you were running from, it was bad enough to come this direction, which means there was no better option. So," she kept her voice flat, not soft, not hard, just level, the voice she used when she needed people to understand she wasn't asking. "Tell me what happened." The woman looked at the 2 men. Something passed between them, the specific shorthand of people who have been in enough shared situations to communicate in fractions. "Captain Revik told us not to talk to anyone," the woman said. "Captain Revik specifically rode in this direction," Celine said. "He knew where I was. He sent me north with exact information about this settlement's location. He didn't ride this way by accident." She held the woman's eyes. "You're talking to exactly the person he came here to talk to, so let's save time." Another pause. The fire in the hearth popped. Outside, the wind was still working. The man with the scar said, "It started 3 weeks after your—" He stopped. 3 weeks after the exile. The Eastern holds first, kids getting sick, fever that wouldn't break. Pack healers said they'd never seen it behave like that, said it had the signature of something introduced rather than something natural. What signature specifically? Color of the waste product, smell of the sweat, the sequence of symptoms. It moved too fast and too clean, hit the young ones hardest, the old ones second, the warriors last. Like it was staged. "Because it was staged," Celine said. The man looked at her. "You knew." "I didn't know, I suspected. But—" She opened her satchel, produced the cloth-wrapped vial, unwrapped it on the table without touching the glass. All 3 of them looked at it. "I found this 6 days ago, 2 hours south of here, off the northern trade road. A logistics transfer I stumbled across. 2 wagons, civilian canvas, 3 people moving cases of this to a pack horse bound north." She watched their faces. "I recognized one of the people. I want you to tell me if you recognize what's in the vial." The woman leaned forward and looked at the amber-yellow residue without touching anything. Her face went still in a specific way. "Where did you get this?" "I just told you." "No, I mean—" She pulled back, looked at the others. "This matches what our healer isolated from the water supply in Hold 7, 2 weeks ago. They traced it backward through the distribution chain and hit a wall at the main Silverfang supply depot." "Because the contamination is coming in at the depot level," Celine said, "or upstream of it. What happened at the depot?" "Captain Revik went to investigate." The man with the scar picked up his cup and put it down without drinking. Came back with documentation from the depot records showing unauthorized supply substitutions over the past 4 months. Routes that didn't match the official manifest. Consignments arriving under seals that didn't match any of our suppliers. He looked at the table. He took the documentation to the Alpha King. Celine was very still. And? The woman said it. Her voice had no inflection in it at all. The Alpha King had him detained, pending investigation for falsifying records. The fire cracked. Wind worked the shutters. Celine sat with the sentence and let it land completely. Let it be what it was. Let herself feel the specific quality of what she was feeling before she filed it away. Seraphine was present for that conversation, the man with the scar said. He wasn't asking. I don't know what, the woman said. I wasn't there. I know Revit got word to us to get him out before the detention order was fully processed. We pulled him out of the hold at midnight 4 days ago. Been riding since. He's sick, Celine said. Started on day 2, same progression as the holds. She looked at the wrapped vial on the table. Thought about a man who had told her the settlement was 7 days north, who had known that information because he'd put her on the road and watched her leave, who had ridden 7 days sick in the wrong season because he'd tried to do the right thing, and the right thing had put him in a detention hold. The documentation he brought the Alpha King, she said. What happened to it? Confiscated, as part of the detention processing. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. Kept her face level because her face was the one thing she still had full control over. Get some sleep, she told them, all 3 of you. In the morning, we're going to talk about what happens next. And what does happen next, the woman asked. Celine picked up the vial, wrapped it, put it back in her chest pocket. We build a case that can't be confiscated. Check. Revik was conscious by morning, which the healer DOS reported in the neutral tone of someone delivering information that was better than it could have been without being good. He was running a fever, and his color was wrong, and he would need time that the situation wasn't obviously going to give him, but he was conscious and coherent, and that was what mattered for the next conversation. Celine sat beside him in the back room while daylight came gray through the single window. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has run out of energy for pretense. You're not supposed to be here, he said. His voice was rough, stripped down. You're the one who told me this settlement was 7 days north. I told you factual information about the terrain. You told me where to be, she said. Not accusing, just clarifying the shape of things. You knew you might need an exit point. You knew I'd be the only person in this direction with any reason to help you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you should know they're saying you already knew about the contamination, that the exile was Kael removing you before you could finish what you started. She received that. Who's saying it? The Alpha King's inner council, Seraphine's people. How many of the inner council are Seraphine's people? A pause that told her more than an answer would have. Enough. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and looked at the man who had, at minimum, tried, who had done what the council had failed to do, had taken evidence to power, and had the experience of what power does when the evidence doesn't serve it. She thought about the version of herself that had been standing at the border 3 weeks ago, believing that if she could just get enough proof, proof would be sufficient. That was the version of herself that had not yet sat in a frontier tavern and heard the shape of what Seraphine had built inside the keep while everyone was looking at the exile. What do you know about Lady Seraphine? She said. Before she arrived. Where she came from, who vouched for her, what the actual documentation of her background looks like. Revik's eyes sharpened despite the fever. You think the identity is constructed? I think a woman who has spent months running a poison distribution network through the Silver Fang supply chain has access and knowledge that requires either a very long con or an inside source. Either she spent years preparing to become exactly the right person to walk into Kael's life, or someone with existing access handed her the architecture. She watched him. The patrol route information they used to exile me. Those routes don't appear in any document accessible outside the senior command structure. Whoever provided them to the witnesses who testified had either direct access or a source inside senior command. He was working through it. She could see him working through it, the fever slowing him but not stopping him. The witnesses, he said slowly. At your hearing. I knew them, both of them. Not well, but by reputation. They had debts, the kind of debts that make people available. Who knew about the debts? It's not, he stopped. It's not information you find easily. It would take someone with access to the garrison's financial oversight records, or someone who had cultivated a source inside financial oversight. He looked at the window, at the gray morning light. How long has she been building this? Long enough, Celine said. Long enough that removing me wasn't improvisation. It was scheduled. She stood. Rest. Drink what DOS gives you. I need you functional in 48 hours. For what? She picked up her jacket from the chair. I need someone who can walk into Silverfang territory with a Silverfang seal and not immediately be detained. I'm a wanted man. You're a sick wanted man with a warrant for record falsification that was generated by the same person who poisoned the pack's water supply. That warrant won't survive sunlight. She looked at him. I need you functional. 48 hours. She spent those 48 hours working. The three riders, their names were Cade, Torin, and Ive, were functional and willing and sufficiently frightened by what they'd already seen to be motivated, which was the best possible combination. Celine put them to work on what they could do from Vels Crossing, which was primarily information gathering. Eve had contacts in the Eastern Hold system, runners who moved through the northern routes and knew who was passing goods and in what directions. Cade had a cousin 3 settlements south who had married into a family that operated one of the supply depots on the secondary Silverfang routes. Torin was quiet and observant and good at sitting in a market and listening to conversations not directed at him. She directed all of this. She sat at the tavern table with the journal open and built the map. Not a geographical map, but an operational one, the kind that shows how things connect rather than where they sit. Every name, every route, every point of exchange she could document or infer. The vial she had was one piece. The depot records Revik had found and lost were another. What she was assembling was the pattern, and the pattern was starting to have a shape she recognized. This was not a simple poison operation. This was not Seraphine acting alone with personal resources. The distribution network was too extensive, the access too specific, the financial architecture behind the untraceable consignments too sophisticated for a single woman, regardless of how capable she was. On the second night, Eve came back from a meeting with one of her runners with a name. Celine looked at it written in her own hand in the journal. The Greyvale Consortium, based in the Southern Independent Territories, operating nominally as a commodities trading house, with interests across 6-pack territories. Known in intelligence circles, she had encountered this name exactly once before, in a briefing at the Silverfang War Table, a briefing marked for senior command only, as an entity with suspected connections to a network that bought and sold political outcomes across the North. They weren't just poisoning Silverfang, they were destabilizing it, weakening it specifically and strategically to create the conditions for something else, a takeover, a forced merger, a territorial carve-up that would benefit whoever held the operational contract with the consortium. And at the center of it, with access to the Alpha King's bed and his trust in his decisions, was a woman who was either the consortium's operative or the consortium's instrument. She closed the journal, thought about how long she had. The pack was already sick. The warriors were weakening. The council had been compromised enough that evidence could be confiscated and witnesses could be bought, and a captain with documentation could be detained on falsified charges. Every day Seraphine maintained her position, the operation progressed. Every day Kael believed he was fighting external enemies and sending warriors against rival packs. The pack bled from the inside where the actual wound was. She had a vial and a journal and 4 people in a frontier settlement and a sick captain who might be able to ride in 48 hours. She had herself. She pulled out the journal again and opened to a fresh page and started writing not an inventory but a sequence, the specific order in which evidence needed to be presented, in front of specific witnesses, in the specific venue where it couldn't be quietly suppressed. It needed to be public. It needed to happen somewhere that Seraphine couldn't control the room, couldn't intercept the documentation, couldn't use Kael as a buffer between the truth and the people who needed to hear it. There was only one venue that qualified. The Blood Moon Gathering. 3 weeks out. every pack leader in the north in one location by treaty requirement, which meant neutral ground, which meant a room Seraphine didn't own, which meant witnesses with enough independent authority that making them disappear afterward would trigger consequences she couldn't contain. 3 weeks. She looked at the window, dark outside, cold, 300 miles of it between her and the keep. She had moved through harder terrain with fewer resources. The calculation was brutal but not impossible. 3 weeks to gather what remained to be gathered, to shore up the evidence chain, to get Revik mobile and back to territory where his uniform carried weight, to put together something that would still be standing when Seraphine tried to tear it down in front of every pack leader in the north. She could do it. She had to do it. She was 3 words into writing the first step of the sequence when her hand stopped. Because under the tavern door, the thin gap between wood and floor where the draft came through, she could see the shadow of feet. Still feet. Not passing. Not approaching the door to knock. Just standing there on the other side, not moving. She closed the journal, put her free hand flat on the table where she could feel the surface, grounding herself in the physical fact of the room. With her other hand, she reached slowly down to the knife at her ankle. The shadow didn't move. She said clearly to the door, "Whoever you are, you have 10 seconds to walk away from that door before I stop being patient." The shadow moved, but it didn't walk away. The door opened. The figure that stepped through was a woman, older, trail-worn, wearing a cloak with no pack seal and the specific posture of someone who had been trained young to never make themselves small in a doorway. She had the kind of face that had been striking once and had evolved into something better than striking, defined, precise, carrying its years without apology. Celine did not put the knife away. "Who are you?" The woman crossed the room without being invited and sat in the chair across the table and looked at the journal and the open page and at Celine's face for a moment. Then she said, "My name is Asha Vane. I am your father's older sister, and you need to know that you are not the first woman the Greyvile Consortium has done this to." She put both hands flat on the table, a gesture of nothing hidden. "I've been hunting these people for 11 years. I've been waiting for someone inside a pack structure to stumble across enough evidence to act on." Her eyes were steady and without theater. "I think that person is you." Outside, the wind was still blowing north, but something in the room had just shifted on its axis, and Celine understood in the space of one held breath that everything she had thought was a ceiling on what was possible had just been removed. Celine didn't sleep that night, not because she couldn't. She had trained herself years ago to sleep in worse conditions than a tavern chair with a fire dying in the hearth. She didn't sleep because Asha Vane sat across from her for 6 hours, and what came out of that woman's mouth demanded full attention, the kind that sleep would have been a betrayal of. Asha had been a logistics coordinator for a Northern Trade Federation 11 years ago. She had noticed discrepancies in a supply chain the same way Celine had noticed discrepancies in the Silverfang Depot records, by accident, by competence, by the specific misfortune of being the kind of person who sees things. The Greyvale Consortium had noticed her noticing. Her husband had died in what the official record called a caravan accident 3 weeks later. Her position had been eliminated. She had been left with nothing except the understanding of what she was dealing with and the decision about what to do with that understanding. She had chosen 11 years of hunting. She laid it out without drama. Names, timelines, methods, the specific operational signature that the consortium used across different territories. The way they always established an inside presence before the external pressure began. The way they always chose targets whose leadership was either unstable or could be made unstable. The way the inside presence was never obviously foreign, always someone who looked like they belonged, who came with documentation that held up to surface scrutiny and collapsed only under the kind of deep investigation that required resources the destabilized target no longer had. Seraphine is not her real name, Asha said. It was close to 3 in the morning. Her real name is Sierra Aldenmore. She's been working for the consortium for at least 7 years that I can document. Before Silverfang, there was a pack in the southeast, the Ashcroft territory. She ran the same operation there. The Alpha of Ashcroft died of a wasting illness before anyone understood what was happening. Celine looked at the woman across the table. "You have documentation of this." "I have 11 years of documentation." Asha reached into the lining of her cloak and produced a compact leather case, worn at the corners, latched twice. She put it on the table between them. Everything I've accumulated, every name, every route, every financial thread I could trace. The problem I have always had is the same problem you have. I can build a case that would convince anyone willing to look at it honestly. But getting that case in front of people who have the authority to act on it, inside a structure that the consortium has already compromised, she stopped. That's the wall I've been running into for 11 years. The Blood Moon Gathering, Celine said. Asha looked at her with the specific expression of someone recognizing a mind that runs parallel to their own. Every pack leader in the North, neutral ground, public record by treaty requirement. She paused. I've been waiting for someone with standing in a consortium target to carry this into that room. Standing I don't have. I'm a dead woman officially. The consortium filed a death record for me 8 years ago through a compliant territorial administrator. I can't walk into that gathering as myself. But I can, Celine said. You're an exiled Luna with charges of treason against your name. I'm an exiled Luna whose exile was manufactured by the same operation you've been documenting for 11 years. Celine put her hand on the leather case. Combined with what I have, what Rivik has, what your documentation shows about the Ashcroft precedent, that's not a rumor. That's a case. 3 weeks. The numbers were already running in her head, brutal and specific. Distance, timing, the sequencing of what needed to happen before she could walk into that gathering without being immediately detained or dismissed. Asha watched her think. You understand, she said carefully, that the moment you move toward that gathering with this material, she'll know. She has people watching. She's always known when the net was closing. I know. The Ashcroft Alpha died before he understood what was happening to him. Kyle Draven is still alive. Asha's voice was neutral, professionally neutral, but underneath it something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite warning. Whatever else is true about him, he's still alive because she hasn't finished. She needs the destabilization to reach a specific threshold before the consortium moves on the territorial claim. She's not done with him yet. Celine took her hand off the case, thought about a man who didn't know he was being used as the instrument of his own pack's destruction, who was sitting in Silverfang Keep right now making decisions based on information that had been constructed to serve someone else's outcome, who had, in his worst moment, looked at 3 years of evidence and discarded it for testimony from people whose debts made them available. She couldn't decide what she felt about that. So she filed it where she filed things that demanded feeling she didn't have time for. I need 2 weeks, she said. I need Rivik mobile. I need your documentation integrated with mine so the chain of evidence is unbroken. And I need an entry point into the gathering that doesn't announce itself before I'm in the room. Asha nodded once. I know someone who can get you a sealed delegate credential. It won't hold up to sustained scrutiny, but it'll get you through the door. She paused. After that, it's on you. After that, it's on me, Celine agreed. She pulled the journal toward her and turned to a fresh page. They worked until dawn. The 2 weeks that followed were the most efficiently brutal of Celine's life. Revik was mobile in 4 days, not 2. The fever had gone deeper than expected, and Doss had been blunt about it, had told Celine in the flat voice of a woman who didn't soften things that pushing him too fast would put him back down permanently. Celine had absorbed that and recalculated and used the extra days to close gaps in the evidence chain she'd identified during the night sessions with Asha. Cade's cousin at the Southern Depot came through with shipping records that cross-referenced with Asha's documentation in 3 separate places. Eve's runner network produced 2 witnesses who had seen the wagon transfers on the northern route and were willing to put their names to written testimony in exchange for protections Selene could not yet officially grant, but committed to in writing anyway, because commitment was the only currency she had. Torin, quietly and without fanfare, produced something none of them had expected, a sealed letter found in the lining of a supply case that had been left behind at one of the transfer points, written in a cipher that took Asha 4 hours to break. The letter was operational correspondence between a consortium logistics coordinator and a contact inside the Silverfang Keep. It contained references to timelines, to the Blood Moon Gathering as a deadline, and to a phrase that appeared twice in the letter and that Asha identified from her 11 years of documentation as the consortium's internal designation for the final phase of a destabilization operation. They were not 3 weeks ahead of the timeline. They were 1 week behind it. The gathering was not just Celine's target. It was Seraphine's. Celine held that understanding for approximately 30 seconds. Let it reconfigure everything. Then she moved faster. The Blood Moon Gathering was held at Thornwall, a neutral fortress in the Highland territory between the 3 largest northern packs. It had been the site of the gathering for 60 years by treaty, chosen originally because it belonged to no pack and could be claimed by none, maintained by a rotating administrative council of pack representatives whose neutrality was enforced by the mutual interest of every signatory. It was, on paper, the safest possible venue for what Celine needed to do. She arrived 1 day early, which was the plan, using the sealed delegate credential Asha's contact had produced under the designation of a minor Eastern Territorial representative. The credential was good enough to get her through the outer gate with a cursory check. She kept her hood up and her pace unhurried and her eyes forward, and she moved through the fortress's receiving corridors with the specific confidence of someone who belonged in every room she entered, which was not a feeling but a decision, a constant active maintenance of posture and pace that required the same kind of effort as holding a heavy object steady. She found the room Asha had specified, a storage chamber on the fortress's 3rd level, accessed through a servant corridor, used during the gathering for supply overflow and therefore low traffic. She secured her materials there, made contact with the 2 other people Asha had positioned inside the fortress in advance, an elderly record keeper with access to the formal proceedings log, and a young warrior from a small eastern pack who owed Asha a debt of the kind that doesn't get called in lightly. The first session of the gathering was the following morning. The full assembly of pack leaders, their seconds, their designated witnesses. By treaty, the proceedings were recorded and the record was distributed to all signatories, which meant that whatever happened in that room became permanent in a way that couldn't be quietly suppressed by any single party. She spent the night in the storage room, back against the wall, the leather case across her knees. She thought about the last time she had stood in a room full of pack leaders. 3 years ago, at Kael's side, at a treaty renegotiation that had gone badly before she'd found the language that salvaged it. She had been good at that, at finding the language, at understanding what people needed to hear versus what they needed to know, and how to deliver both in the same sentence. She was going to need to be better than good tomorrow. She closed her eyes, did not sleep. Let the hours pass with the specific discipline of waiting for a thing you cannot accelerate. The Assembly Hall of Thornwall held 200 people comfortably and 300 under duress. On the morning of the first session, it held somewhere between the two, the floor dense with pack delegations in their respective colors, the elevated horseshoe of leadership seats holding 11 alpha-level representatives and their immediate seconds. Kyle was in the 3rd seat from the left. She saw him before he saw her. He looked the same, and he looked different. Same physical architecture. Same quality of controlled stillness, but something in the set of his jaw was wrong. Something in the way he held the arm of his chair was the specific tension of a man who had been maintaining a posture under pressure for long enough that it had started to show. He looked like Silverfang's alpha. He also looked like a man who hadn't slept well in 3 weeks. Seraphine was not in the hall. Celine processed that absence immediately. Seraphine should have been present. As the consort of the Silverfang Alpha attending a formal gathering, her absence from the opening session was a protocol irregularity, small enough to have an innocent explanation, large enough to register. She filed it, stayed in her position near the back wall, credential around her neck, hood still up because the hall was cold, and that was reason enough. The session opened with the standard procedural readings. She watched the room, watched the Silverfang delegation specifically, cataloging faces, checking her internal register of who she knew against who was present. 2 of the senior captains she recognized. The pack's formal second, a man named Graydon who had always been loyal to Kael personally rather than institutionally. She noted his position and his expression. He was watching Kael with the same quality of careful attention she was using. She was 40 minutes into the session, waiting for the formal opening of the evidence floor. the treaty-protected period when any representative could bring a matter of interpack concern to the assembly, when the side door opened. She turned with the rest of the room. Seraphine walked in. Not late, not rushed, not apologetic about either. She wore the Silverfang colors, and she wore them like she'd been born in them, and she moved through the room toward the Silverfang delegation with the unhurried precision of a woman who had decided on this particular morning that she was done performing the supporting role. She sat beside Kael, said something to him. He turned toward her with an expression that Celine, from 50 feet away, could not fully read. Then Seraphine looked up, directly across the room, and found Celine's eyes. She did not react. Her expression did not change, not 1 degree, and that was the confirmation Celine had already known she would get. Seraphine had known she was here, had known before she walked in. Had walked in anyway, with that specific unhurried precision, because she had decided that Celine being here was already accounted for. Celine felt the cold anger in her chest recalibrate again. Drop lower, sharpen harder. The evidence floor opened. She moved. She was halfway across the room when the Assembly's procedural officer, a neutral third-party position held by a rotated representative, stepped forward and said, in the formal voice of the role, "The delegate credential for the Eastern Vel territory has been flagged for verification. Will the holder please identify themselves?" The room's attention shifted. Celine stopped walking. She looked at the procedural officer, saw the slight quality of discomfort in his posture. Not malicious, not conspiring, genuinely following an instruction that had been given to him by someone whose authority in this context was legitimate. A routine verification flag. Triggered, she understood in the 2 seconds of stillness that followed, by someone who had known her credential was counterfeit and had chosen this specific moment to flag it. She turned and looked at Seraphine. Seraphine was watching her with an expression that Celine now understood for what it was. Not sorrow, not calculated performance, but genuine satisfaction. The satisfaction of a professional who has outmaneuvered a problem before the problem became threatening. The room was very quiet. Celine reached up and took her hood down. Let them see her face. Watched the recognition move through the Silverfang delegation like a stone through still water. Watched it hit Kael. Saw him go very still. Saw the gray-blue eyes fix on her with an intensity that had no immediate readable content, that was just the full force of his attention suddenly landing on a thing he had not expected to see. "My name," she said into the silence of the assembly hall, loudly enough to carry without effort, "is Celine Vane, former Luna of the Silverfang Pack. I am standing in this room under a counterfeit credential because my legitimate entry was made impossible by the same operation I am here to expose. I am requesting the Assembly's treaty protection for the presentation of evidence in a matter of immediate interpack consequence." The room erupted. Not chaos. These were pack leaders and their seconds, people trained to function in crisis. But the specific controlled eruption of 200 people processing a major development simultaneously. She heard her name from multiple directions, heard the word exile, heard the word treason, heard other things she let pass through without catching. Above it all, she heard Seraphine say, clearly and without raising her voice, because Seraphine understood that calm was the most dangerous weapon available in a loud room. This woman was exiled from Silverfang territory on charges of collusion with enemy factions. Her presence here violates the terms of her exile order and should be considered confirmation of her continued hostility to Pack. "I have documentation," Celine said. Held up the leather case. 11 years of operational records from the Greyvile Consortium's destabilization activities across northern Pack territories. I have supply chain records from the Silverfang Depot showing unauthorized material substitutions over 4 months. I have a sealed letter recovered from a consortium transfer point containing explicit reference to the Blood Moon Gathering as an operational deadline. She looked at the room, at the 11 alpha-level faces in the horseshoe of seats, and she made herself meet each one, because eye contact in this room was the language of authority, and she was not going to speak any other language. I am requesting the floor. Under Article 7 of the Gathering Charter, any representative, regardless of Pack standing, may present evidence of a threat to the collective Northern Alliance. I'm invoking that article. The procedural officer looked at the assembly chair, a Thornwall neutral position, currently held by an older alpha from the Midlands named Voss, who had a reputation for institutional fastidiousness that Celine was counting on. Voss looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Seraphine. Then he said, in the precise diction of a man consulting the treaty in his memory, Article 7 is confirmed as applicable. The Assembly will hear the presentation. He looked at the procedural officer. The credential flag is suspended under Article 7 protection. The presenter has the floor. It was the right outcome. It lasted exactly 40 seconds. The explosion that tore through the fortress's eastern wall was not large. It was not designed to be large. It was designed to be specific, targeted at the corridor that connected the assembly hall to the secure holding area where the gathering's treaty records were maintained. The sound was massive in the enclosed space of the fortress, a pressure wave that moved through the assembly hall and knocked people sideways and dropped dust from the ceiling in a pale sheet. In the 4 seconds of stunned stillness that followed before the room reorganized itself, Celine looked at the spot where Seraphine had been sitting. The seat was empty. She had moved before the explosion, had been moving before the sound, which meant she had known the timing, which meant this was not a response to Celine invoking Article 7. This had been prepared in advance, a contingency for exactly this scenario, triggered not because Celine had gotten into the room, but because Seraphine had decided the timeline was moving regardless of whether Celine was contained. The gathering was the deadline, not for Celine's evidence, for Seraphine's operation. The room was transitioning from stun to active. Warriors reaching for weapons, alphas getting to their feet, voices rising. In the controlled chaos, Celine moved, not toward the door, not toward safety, but toward the Silverfang delegation, toward the one face in the room that she needed because everything else she had prepared for this moment had just been structurally altered by an explosion, and the only remaining path to the outcome she needed ran directly through the man who had exiled her. She reached Kael in the moment he was rising from his chair, one hand on the hilt at his side, scanning the room for threat assessment. Their eyes met at a distance of 3 feet. 3 years. A throne room. A verdict without testimony. 300 miles of winter. His expression was not the one from the throne room. It was not the controlled public face, not the stonewall decision already made expression. It was something rawer than that, something that lived in the place where his armor hadn't been fast enough to deploy in the half-second of genuine shock. "She's gone," Celine said. Her voice was steady. She held the leather case between them. "She planned for me to be here. She planned for this. The operation completes tonight unless you listen to me right now in this room while I still have 200 witnesses." His jaw was tight. His eyes were working. She could see them working, pulling information, running calculations, the same mind she had watched operate at 4 in the morning in the war room when the situation was worst and he was best. "You have a counterfeit credential," he said, "because your consort's network flagged my real identity to the border security 6 days ago. I've been trying to get into this room for 2 weeks. She held his gaze. "I know what she is. I know what she's done to your pack. And I know that what just happened to that wall is the beginning of the endgame she's been building toward since before she ever walked into your keep." His hand was still on the hilt. Around them, the room was reorganizing, warriors forming defensive clusters, alphas pulling their delegations together, the procedural structure of the gathering giving way to the operational instincts of people who led armies. "Show me," Kael said. She opened the leather case on his chair. Before she could lay the first document down, Graydon, Kael's second, the man she had identified as watching his alpha with careful attention, appeared at Kael's shoulder, leaned in, and said something in a voice too low for her to catch. Kael's expression changed. It changed in a specific way, not the storm sky hardening she knew from his public face. Something underneath that. Something that looked, in the fraction before he controlled it, like a man receiving the confirmation of a fear he had been carrying alone for longer than he'd admitted. He looked up from Graydon, looked at Celine. "The northern wing," he said. His voice had dropped. "Seraphine's quarters. Graydon found... He stopped. Something moved through his face. 3 of my senior captains are locked in a room in the northern wing. They've been there since last night. She told me they were securing the gathering perimeter. Celine went still. That's not what they were doing, she said. No. His jaw worked. No, it wasn't. In the eastern corridor, through the settling dust of the explosion, she could hear shouting in a register that meant conflict rather than emergency response. Active fighting, not evacuation. The operation wasn't just the gathering. The fortress itself was the target. The concentration of Northern Pack leadership in one location. The moment when every significant alpha was present and their home territories were minimally defended. If the consortium moved on the territorial claims tonight, while every pack leader was dealing with a manufactured crisis inside Thornwall, she looked at Kyle. He was already looking at her. How many people does she have inside this fortress? He said. I don't know exactly. She was already moving, pulling documents from the case and pressing them into his hands. But I know the entry point she used, and I know she has someone in the Thornwall administrative staff because that credential flag was too precise to have come from a standard check. She met his eyes one final time, flat and direct, and without any of the things that would come later when there was time for them. You can decide later whether you believe me. Right now you need to move. He looked at the documents in his hands, at the consortium seal at the top of the first page. The same seal Asha had identified across 11 years of operational records. His eyes moved down the page with the speed of a man who reads operational intelligence for a living. He handed the documents to Graydon. Secure those, he said. Then, to Celine, with the specific quality of a man making a decision he knew he couldn't unmake. Stay close. And if this goes wrong, it won't, she said. She didn't know if that was true. She said it anyway. Because the alternative to saying it was acknowledging that they were standing in a fortress that had just been breached, surrounded by an operation that had spent months preparing for exactly this night, with 3 locked captains and a missing Seraphine and the entire Northern Pack leadership concentrated in one building that someone had decided was a target. She had one hand on her kit knife and Asha's 11 years of documentation and a man who had exiled her and was now the only viable ally in the room. This was the shape of what the situation had become. She breathed in. Let the cold anger settle into something that was past anger entirely. Something quieter and harder and more durable. The specific state of a person who has stopped managing how they feel about what's happening and started simply functioning inside it. She moved toward the sound of the fighting. The eastern corridor smelled like burning. Not wood, stone doesn't burn, but the acrid chemical bite of whatever accelerant had been packed into the charge that blew the wall, still hanging in the air in a thin haze that made the torchlight strange and diffuse. Celine moved through it with Kyle 2 steps to her left and Graydon 3 steps behind, and around them the fortress was reorganizing itself from gathering to combat with the specific efficiency of people whose base state was always 1 degree below emergency. The fighting was ahead and to the right. She could hear it in the register she'd learned to read from years of sitting in war rooms. Not the chaotic percussion of a skirmish, but the structured violence of a coordinated breach, which meant the people doing it had a specific objective and were moving toward it rather than simply creating chaos. Chaos was a byproduct, not the goal. Northern stairwell, she said, without slowing. If she has people already inside the fortress and she triggered the charge herself, she's moving on a timer. She has something she needs to reach before the pack leaders consolidate their forces and lock down the building. The treaty vault, Kyle said. His voice had the flat quality of a man confirming something he'd already calculated. The original compact documents. If the consortium can claim the Thornwall Compact was signed under fraudulent terms, they don't need the real documents. They need the vault to be empty long enough to establish doubt. She took the corner at the stairwell entrance and stopped. One of Seraphine's people was at the bottom of the stairs. 2 more at the midpoint landing. They were holding the approach, which meant the asset they were protecting was already above. Kale came up beside her and looked at the stairwell without any visible adjustment to his breathing. That specific quality of stillness she had once read as depth. She understood now that it was genuine, that this was the environment he'd been built for, that whatever failures of judgment had happened in the throne room, in a corridor with drawn weapons, he was exactly what he presented as. "How many do you think she has total?" he said. "Based on the letter and the logistics, 20, maybe 25. Enough to hold corridors and create pressure while the actual objective is achieved. Not enough for a sustained fight against a consolidated pack response." "So the window is short. Her window is already closing. She knows that." She looked at him. "She's not extracting, she's completing." He processed that for 1 second. Then he moved, and what followed happened fast. He took the stairwell at a pace that was below reckless and above cautious, and Celine moved with him because standing still wasn't an option, and because this was the specific situation in which the only viable choice was also the dangerous one. Graydon came behind them. The two guards at the midpoint landing reacted with professional speed, but not fast enough. Cale hit the first one with the specific economy of a man who had been fighting since before he had words for it. Controlled and brutal. Not a motion wasted, and she took the second in the half. Second, his attention was divided. Knife at his wrist, leverage applied. The specific technique her father's garrison trainer had drilled into her at 15 until it was reflex rather than thought. They were past the landing before the second man hit the stone. The door at the top of the stairs was open. The northern wing of Thornwall was quieter than the floor below, which was worse. Noise meant active conflict, meant the timeline was still running. Quiet meant something had already resolved. Celine felt the sweat between her shoulder blades and the way her pulse was running high and fast in her throat, and the specific alertness of a body that has stopped worrying about discomfort because it has accepted the possibility of worse. She had been afraid before, had learned to function inside fear rather than around it, had understood that the only difference between a person who acts and a person who freezes is not the absence of fear, but the maintenance of the part of the brain that chooses. She was choosing. The treaty vault was at the end of the northern corridor behind a reinforced door. The door was open. The two Thornwall administrative staff who should have been guarding it were on the floor, restrained, alive. She could see the rise and fall of their chests as she passed, kept alive because bodies created official incidents, and Seraphine, even at the operational endgame, was managing her exposure. She stepped through the vault door. Seraphine was at the central document case. She had what she'd come for. A sealed case of her own, compact, designed for transport, already latched. She looked up when the three of them entered, and her expression was not surprise. It was never surprise with this woman. It was the face of someone who had included this variable in the calculation. "You made it further than I expected," she said. To Celine, not to Kael. The specific quality of that direction was its own statement. Celine had been the operative concern all along, not the Alpha King. "The credential flag should have held you through the first session. I underestimated your contact network." "You underestimated a lot of things," Celine said. "The explosion was elegant," Kael said. His voice was not loud. It was the quiet register, the dangerous one. He was looking at Seraphine with an expression Celine had not seen on him before. Not anger, not betrayal in the soft sense of the word, but something ground level and cold. The expression of a man who has been running on compromised information for months and has just understood the full scope of the compromise. "I want to know one thing." Seraphine looked at him for the first time. "The children in the eastern holds," he said. "The fever. You knew." A pause. In that pause, Celine watched something move across Seraphine's face. Not guilt, because guilt requires a framework she did not appear to operate in, but the specific calculation of whether honesty served her better than deflection in this particular room. She decided on honesty, which told Celine everything about how confident she was in the next 30 seconds. "They were below the lethal threshold," Seraphine said. "The compound was calibrated. The mortality outcome in the holds was within acceptable parameters for the operational objective." The silence that followed that sentence had a texture. Kael crossed the room. He moved fast, faster than the distance made intuitive, and Seraphine was already moving. She had expected it, had positioned herself with the document case as a partial barrier, and she was competent, genuinely competent, with the case in one hand and a blade that had been at her forearm suddenly in the other. The blade was short, curved, Not a fighting weapon, but a utility knife used with the precision of someone who knew exactly what it could and couldn't do. She drew a line across his forearm before he got the inside position. Celine was moving before the sound of his breath through his teeth. She came in from the left, the angle Seraphine hadn't fully accounted for because her attention was weighted toward Kael, and she hit the knife wrist with the same leverage technique from the stairwell, and this time she had the angle and the commitment, and the knife went sideways, hit the stone floor, spun. Seraphine wrenched backward, got a step of distance, put the document case between herself and both of them. "You can't keep those," Celine said. Her breathing was harder now. "Those documents go back in the case. Ashavane's documentation, the depot records, the cipher letter, all of it is already in that assembly hall. Graydon has copies. You cannot walk out of this fortress with anything that matters." "I don't need the treaty documents," Seraphine said. Her voice was still even. There was a cut at her cheekbone, origin unclear, and she was breathing hard but controlled. "I need the delay." The consortium's territorial agents moved on 3 Silverfang holds at first light this morning. By the time you get back to your territory, she looked at Kael. The eastern sector is already under contested claim. You can expose everything I've done. It won't change the ground position. Kael's arm was bleeding through his sleeve. He was looking at her with the expression she had called cold earlier, and understood now was something below cold. The emotional register that exists on the other side of all the manageable feelings. The one that doesn't perform, that simply calculates. "Who is the alpha you serve?" he said. "That's not a conversation we're going to have. It's the only conversation I want to have right now." "Then you're going to be disappointed." She took a step toward the vault's secondary exit. A service door in the left wall, half concealed by the document shelving, that Celine had not had time to close and secure because they'd come through the main entrance fast. She saw Celine register the door and register that she'd seen it. "I built 14 months of work in your pack. 14 months inside your house, in your bed, and your council room. I know every weakness in Silverfang's eastern defense because I sat beside the man who designed it and asked the right questions." Another step. "You can arrest me. You can expose the consortium. The holds are already taken." "Walk through that door," Celine said, "and you become the evidence." Seraphine stopped. "Right now, you're a woman the consortium will disavow the moment it's convenient," Celine said. She kept her voice flat, kept her body still, kept the full weight of her attention on the woman's eyes. "You know how they operate. You've seen it. When the exposure comes, and it's coming, I have 11 years of their operational history, and your name is threaded through the last 2. They will give you to whoever is asking to protect the network above you. That's what you are to them. A unit of operational expenditure." She paused 1 beat. "Or you give us the alpha behind the territorial claim. Tonight. In that assembly hall. In front of 200 witnesses with treaty protection, which is the only protection that will still exist for you tomorrow morning." The service door was 6 feet behind Seraphine. The assembly hall was 3 floors below. The consortium's agents were in the eastern hold. Celine watched the calculation run behind Seraphine's eyes and understood that this was the thing about genuinely capable opponents. They don't stop calculating, not even at the end. And the calculation is always real, always driven by actual logic rather than emotion, and that made them both more predictable and more dangerous than someone acting on feeling. Seraphine bolted for the service door. Kael was already moving, and Celine half a step behind him, and the 3 of them hit the service corridor in a cascade, stone walls close on both sides, a stairwell descending fast and tight. Below, a maintenance level, then what Celine didn't know, and running in an unfamiliar building behind a woman who had been inside this fortress for 2 days and had mapped it was the specific kind of disadvantage that killed people. She ran anyway, because there was no option that wasn't this. The maintenance level opened into a long, low room that smelled of stored oil and old wood. Supply storage, the underbelly of the fortress's operational infrastructure, lit by a single line of torches along the right wall. Seraphine crossed it fast, and Kael was gaining on her, the blood on his forearm dark against his sleeve, his breathing hard but patterned, the breathing of a man who runs on will when the body's reserves are being spent. She turned. She had something in her hand, not the blade. She had lost the blade in the vault. Something smaller. A vial, not amber yellow, clear. And Celine recognized in the half-second before Seraphine's arm moved that it was a different compound entirely, recognized it from Asha's documentation, recognized what it was used for. Kael! She hit him sideways with her full body weight. They both went down on the stone floor, and the vial shattered somewhere to the right, the compound spreading on the stone in a spreading wet circle, and the smell that came off it was sharp enough to make her eyes water immediately. She got her face down into her sleeve, heard Kael doing the same beside her. The compound was contact and inhalation, not purely airborne. The floor was the danger zone. She pushed up and got her feet under her without using her hands on the stone, the specific horror of the trained body responding to the threat it knew. Seraphine was at the far door. Kael was on his feet. His eyes were red at the edges from the exposure, and his breathing was wrong, too shallow, the beginning of the compound's respiratory effect. And he was moving toward the door anyway, with the specific irrational commitment of a man who has decided that the outcome of this situation is not negotiable. "Stop," Celine said. Not to Seraphine, to him. He stopped, looked at her. "You go through that door right now. She has another 30 seconds of lead, and a building she knows, and a respiratory compromise that will worsen in the next 5 minutes. She met his eyes, held them, forced the speed of the situation to slow inside the space of her own chest, even when her pulse was doing the opposite. "You trust me or you don't, right now. Which is it?" 3 seconds. The compound's smell was thinning as it spread. The wet circle on the floor had defined its edges. "I trust you," he said. And the quality of it, rough, certain, stripped of everything performative, was the most honest thing she had heard from him in 3 years. "Then listen." She was already moving toward the left side of the room, the wall-parallel path that skirted the compound's spread zone, calculating the building's layout from what she'd mapped in her mind coming down. There's only one exit from this fortress that leads to the exterior access points she'd have used for her extraction route. Asha's contact showed me the fortress layout last night. Southern maintenance exit comes out at the stable yard. She reached the far door, the one on the left, pulled it. Stairs going up, not down. "Graydon," she said, and he was there, coming down through the vault entrance behind them. "Southern maintenance exit. Take 2 people. Right now." He was already moving. She looked at Kael. His arm was still bleeding. His breathing was still shallow. He was looking at her with the gray-blue eyes that had condemned her in a throne room and had just said, "I trust you," in a burning-smelling storage room. And the distance between those 2 moments was 3 weeks of frozen north and 11 years of someone else's documentation and a vial of amber-yellow residue carried against her ribs. "The assembly hall," she said. "Whatever else happens tonight, we have to get back to that room. She has people between here and there. She has fewer people than she started with." She pulled the door fully open. "And we have each other." He looked at her for one more second. In that second, she saw something she had not expected to see. Not the storm sky hardening, not the controlled public face, but the raw version underneath, the one that had said, "I trust you without armor," the one that was carrying 3 weeks of something alongside her own 3 weeks, and neither of them had words for it yet, and both of them knew the words would come later, if later was a thing they survived. "Move," she said. They moved. The corridor above the maintenance level was clear for 30 seconds, then not. 2 of Seraphine's people holding the junction at the second-level landing, and this was no longer the leverage and positioning combat of a stairwell, but the full contact violence of people who were running out of options and knew it. Kael took the first, and she took the second, and it was ugly and direct and cost them both something in the physical ledger. A cut along her shoulder she registered as sensation without fully processing yet, a blow to his already compromised arm that made his breathing hitch badly. They came through the second level and into the main body of the fortress with blood on their hands and the sound of the assembly hall ahead. The doors were closed. Through them she could hear the muffled evidence of a room that was organized and armed and waiting. 200 people who had heard an explosion and had not scattered because these were pack leaders and their warriors, and scattering was not in their vocabulary. She put her hand on the door, felt Kael beside her, 2 inches away, his breathing steadying, that extraordinary discipline reasserting itself over the body's objections. She felt the specific quality of standing beside someone in the last moment before a thing becomes irreversible. The last breath before the jump, the last silence before the sentence. 3 weeks ago, he had sent her into the winter. Tonight, he had said, "I trust you," in a room that smelled like burning. Neither thing canceled the other. Both things were true. She had learned somewhere in the frozen north that the world does not simplify itself for the convenience of the people living in it. That complicated is not the same as broken, that some things have to be held whole and jagged before they can be held at all. She was going to walk through this door and stand in front of 200 people with blood on her jacket and evidence in her hands, and she was going to do what she had come here to do. Whatever came after that, the reckoning, the accounting, the long and probably painful work of understanding what 3 years and 3 weeks and tonight had made of 2 people, that was after. She pushed the door open. The assembly hall fell silent as they entered. 200 faces, every one of them turning, taking in the blood and the evidence case still held in her left hand, and the Alpha King of Silverfang standing at her side. At the far end of the hall's secondary entrance, the doors burst open. Graydon came through first, behind him 2 of his people, and between them, restrained and with the specific expression of someone who has completed the final calculation and found the number unacceptable, Seraphine. Cira Aldenmore. The hall was absolutely still. Celine walked to the center of the floor, set the leather case on the speaker's table, opened it with both hands, with the full assembly watching, looked up at 11 alpha-level faces in the horseshoe of seats, and found, at the 3rd seat from the left, gray-blue eyes that were already on her. She opened her mouth. And from somewhere in the hall, from a direction she hadn't fully cleared, she heard the single sharp sound of a crossbow mechanism releasing. The bolt hit the speaker's table, 6 inches to her left, close enough that she felt the air of it, the displaced rush of something moving very fast through space that her body had just occupied. The leather case rocked from the impact, and she had her hand on it before she had consciously decided to move. The instinct of someone who understood that the case was the only thing in this room that couldn't be replaced. The hall exploded. Not the controlled eruption of earlier. This was the real thing. 200 people moving simultaneously, warriors pulling blades, pack leaders dropping below the sightlines of their elevated seats, the sound of it enormous and shapeless in the enclosed stone space. She heard Graydon shout something at the far end, heard answering shouts she couldn't locate, felt rather than saw Kyle move, felt the displacement of air as he stepped across her position and put himself between her and the direction the bolt had come from. She looked up. The bolt had come from the gallery level, the observation tier above the main floor, accessible by a separate stair designed for overflow attendants. She could see the figure there in the moment before they moved, already pulling back from the gallery rail with the unhurried efficiency of a professional who had made the shot they intended and was repositioning. They had not intended to hit her. The understanding arrived complete and cold. The bolt had landed 6 inches away. A person with a crossbow from that distance, that angle, does not miss 6 inches by accident. The shot was a message, a disruption, not an execution. Timed to hit exactly when she was opening the case, when the room's attention was focused on her, when the maximum number of people would see the Alpha King of Silverfang step across to shield the woman he'd exiled 3 weeks ago. She turned to look at Seraphine. Seraphine, in Graydon's grip at the far door, was watching Kael's position with the flat attention of someone watching a planned outcome execute on schedule, and in that look, Celine finally saw the full shape of what the endgame had always been. Not just destabilization, not just the territorial claim on the eastern holds. The visible image of Kael protecting Celine, broadcast to every pack leader in the Northern Alliance, an exiled Luna, returned under counterfeit credentials, standing at the Alpha King's side with her hand on a document case. The story it would tell without a single word spoken, the questions it would generate, the way it would complicate every piece of evidence Celine presented, every testimony, every chain of proof, because the first question any halfway skeptical pack leader would ask is what is her interest in this outcome, and the image Seraphine had just manufactured gave that question a very specific and damaging answer. Celine straightened, pulled her hand off the case, stepped out from behind Kael's position and moved forward, around the speaker's table, into the open center of the floor, where there was no cover and no position and nowhere to be except exactly where everyone could see her. She raised her voice over the noise of the room. "The bolt was intentional," she said, loud, clear, cutting through the chaos with the specific quality of a voice that has spent 3 years learning how to make itself heard in rooms full of people who did not want to listen. "Not to kill me, to make you see him step in front of me, to make you wonder why." She turned a full circle, facing every section of the gallery and the floor. "She needs you to distrust this evidence before you read it. That's the last tool she has left. Don't give it to her." The room did not fully quiet, but it shifted. The quality of the noise changed from reactive to attentive. The figure in the gallery had gone still. "Secure the gallery," Kyle said. His voice carried without effort. The command register, the one she had heard in every war room and every crisis and every moment when Silverfang's survival had been a question rather than an assumption. 2 warriors were already moving for the gallery stair. She put both hands on the case and looked at Alpha Voss in the center of the leadership horseshoe. "I am requesting 10 minutes, she said, under Article 7. The room is already compromised and the clock is running on the consortium's Eastern Hold operation. 10 minutes. Voss looked at her for a long moment, looked at the bolt still buried in the speaker's table, looked at Kyle. "The room will come to order," Voss said. His voice was the sound of 60 years of institutional authority. "The presenter has 10 minutes. Fine." She had prepared for this moment for 3 weeks. She delivered it in 7. She laid the documentation out in sequence. Asha's 11-year operational record first, establishing the consortium's pattern across multiple territories, because pattern was the foundation that made everything else credible. The Ashcroft precedent second, naming Sierra Aldenmore specifically and connecting the identity to the woman currently restrained at the far door. The Silverfang Depot records third, cross-referenced with the cipher letter, showing the timeline of the contamination operation against her own exile date and a juxtaposition that didn't require commentary. The vial last, the physical evidence held up in its cloth wrapping, identified in its chemical composition by the testimony she read aloud from Revik's signed statement, sick in a settlement 300 miles north, writing in a hand she knew. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She read the record and let the record speak in the flat, final language of documented fact, which is the only language that cannot be interrupted or redirected once it is fully in a room. At the 6-minute mark, she saw the first pack leader in the horseshoe lean forward. At the 7-minute mark, she stopped talking and stood with her hands at her sides and let the silence do the last of the work. Voss looked down the horseshoe. 10 of the 11 leadership seats were occupied by people whose expressions had made the transition from skepticism to the specific stillness of reckoning. The 11th seat was empty. The representative from the Marvel Southeastern Territory, who had not appeared at the gathering's opening session, whose absence Celine had noted and filed and now understood. "The Marvel delegate," she said. Voss looked at the empty seat. "Has not been present since last evening," he said carefully. "The Alpha Seraphine serves," Celine said. "That's the answer to the question KL asked in the vault. Check the Marvel territory's eastern border against the Silverfang holds that were moved on this morning. The consortium doesn't claim territory. They broker it. The Marvel Alpha paid for this operation and was given a window to move while every other northern pack leader was contained in this room." She watched Voss's face as he completed the calculation. "Close the fortress," he said to the room. "No one exits pending verification. Someone find me a runner to the Marvel border." What followed was not clean. Nothing about the hours after the Assembly's lockdown was clean or simple or the kind of resolution that arrives in a single moment and stays arrived. The gallery figure was apprehended, one of Seraphine's remaining people, the last one mobile inside the fortress. 3 pack leaders sent riders from the Thornwall gates within the hour, moving on their own territorial assessments. The Marvel Alpha, it was confirmed by midday through a Thornwall communication relay, had withdrawn his border forces back to his own territory when the window closed, when the consortium's timeline failed to execute because Seraphine was in custody and the evidence was in the room. He had, in the particular cowardice of a man who had paid for a war he expected other people to fight, retreated rather than committed. The eastern holds reported Silverfang colors still flying by late afternoon. Celine sat on a stone bench in the Thornwall courtyard when she received that information and felt the thing in her chest that had been running at cold anger for 3 weeks finally go still. Not peace. Not yet. Something closer to the moment after a long run when the body has finished and hasn't yet registered that it's finished, the transition state between effort and rest. Kyle found her there. He sat on the bench without asking, which was, she thought, the most honest thing he could have done. Not requesting, not apologizing in advance, just sitting. He'd had his arm properly treated. It was wrapped clean below the sleeve. He was carrying 2 cups of something, and he put one beside her on the bench without speaking. She picked it up, drank. It was bitter and too hot, and she was grateful for both qualities. Revik is going to be all right, Kael said after a while. I know. Doss sent a rider. She looked at the courtyard. The afternoon light was thin and pale, winter light, the kind that illuminates without warming. The 3 captains she locked in the wing? Shaken, angry, fine. A pause. They were angry on your behalf before any of this. Marin, too. She came to my private chambers 2 weeks ago and told me the council vote had been wrong. His jaw worked. I told her the evidence was clear. Celine said nothing. I needed it to be clear, he said. And there it was, like, not the explanation, not the defense, but the interior truth underneath, the thing that had been operating below his judgment and making itself into certainty. She had been building the case against you for months before I even registered what she was doing. By the time it was presented, I had been prepared to receive it. I didn't know that was what had happened. I do now. He looked at his hands. That is not an excuse. No, Celine said. It's not. He looked at her. But it's the truth, she said. And I'm done with things that aren't the truth. The courtyard was quiet around them. Somewhere above, on the fortress walls, guards were moving through their rotations. The ordinary maintenance of security in a place that had spent the morning at war and was now learning how to be a fortress again. She understood that process intimately. The learning how to be the thing again after it's been tested against its own limits. I made a decision in that throne room, Kael said, based on evidence I was given by the person who fabricated it. And I know that the responsible accounting of that is that I should have seen it, should have looked harder, should have trusted what 3 years of evidence told me about who you were, rather than what 3 days of manufactured testimony told me about what you'd done. He stopped. I am telling you that I failed you, not as my Luna, as a person who deserved to be believed. She sat with that. She had carried those words for 3 weeks as an absence, had felt the shape of them the way you feel the shape of something missing, the specific ache of what had not been said in the throne room and should have been. Now they were present. She tested herself against them and found something she hadn't fully predicted, not the relief of vindication, which she had imagined might feel like warmth. Instead, something quieter. The recognition of the words as true, which was different from the words making the damage undone. I know, she said. That doesn't fix it. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He was quiet. In the quality of his silence, she heard him receive that without flinching from it, which was the thing she needed him to do. Not argue toward forgiveness, not manage the distance between the failure and the present, but simply hold what was true without requiring her to make it easier. What do you want? He said. Not what the Alliance requires or what Silverfang needs. You. What do you want? She looked at the winter light on the stones. What she wanted was not a simple inventory. Some of it was large and institutional. She had been thinking about the law she intended to propose since the second day of her exile, had drafted the language for it in her journal during long northern nights, had refined it with Asha and with the cold clarity that distance provides. No Luna, no bonded partner of a pack alpha, could be exiled without formal hearing, without the right to face accusers, without a council vote that required independent witness testimony. That was the structural change, the thing that meant none of this happened again to any other woman in any other pack. Some of it was smaller and harder to name. The Eastern holds, healing. The supply chains cleaned and rebuilt. Revik reinstated with record cleared. Mira, somewhere in the Silverfang household, given a position that matched her capability. The children in the eastern holds, their fevers breaking as the contamination was removed from the supply lines, and the healers worked with the documentation Celine had brought back to identify the correct treatment protocol. And some of it was sitting on a stone bench in a courtyard with the specific awareness that there was a person beside her with whom something had not been completed, and the incompleteness was not comfortable, and she was not going to resolve it prematurely because premature resolution was just a different kind of dishonesty. "I want the law changed," she said, "formally, by unanimous Pack Council vote. I want the Eastern holds treated. I want Revik's record cleared and the contamination documentation presented to every pack in the Northern Alliance." She paused. "I want to go home and do the work of rebuilding what was broken, because it was a good pack before it was poisoned. It can be a good pack again." He was watching her with the full weight of his attention. "And us," he said. "That," she said, "is going to take longer than this bench." Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not yet, but the terrain of a smile, the preparatory shift. "I know. I'm not the person I was when I walked into that throne room," she said. "I don't say that as a warning. I say it as a fact. Whatever you thought you understood about me before were what I needed, what I would accept, what I would build my life around. 3 weeks in the northern wilds with an aunt I didn't know I had, and a sick captain and a document case has finished that version. The person who comes back to Silverfang is not the one you sent away." She looked at him directly. "I need you to understand that before anything else." "I understand it," he said. "Do you?" "The person who sent you away," he said, "is not the one sitting on this bench either. And the rawness in that was genuine, the kind that doesn't perform, the kind that has been stripped down to the actual thing underneath all the architecture of authority and control. I have been sitting with what I did for 3 weeks in a keep full of people I couldn't trust, and a woman I understood too late was building a fire under everything I thought I'd built. And I have been sitting with what that means about who I was, and I don't like most of what I found." She believed him. That was the thing she had not been certain she would be able to do, and discovered, in the moment of hearing it, that she could. Not easily, not without the weight of everything it had cost, but clearly, with the same clarity that the northern wilds had stripped her down to, the same unobstructed vision that comes when there is nothing between you and the truth except distance and cold. "Then we start there," she said. The law passed 3 weeks later by unanimous council vote, including 3 members who had voted for her exile and who cast their votes in the public record with the specific expression of people who understood that accountability and continuation are not mutually exclusive. Celine read the language of the enacted provision standing at the council table with the winter light coming through the high windows of Silverfang Keep and felt the resonance of it. Not triumph, which requires an opponent's defeat as its fuel, but something more durable. The satisfaction of a change that will outlast the people who made it, that will protect someone she will never meet in a situation she will never know about, that is the closest thing to permanence available in a world that does not offer permanence as a standard feature. The Eastern holds were clean by early spring. The healer teams worked through the winter with the treatment protocols derived from Asha's documentation and the compound analysis, and the children in Hold 7 were the first to turn the corner, their fevers breaking in the hard cold of the season's deepest weeks, and not returning. Celine visited the holds herself, walked through them with the specific attention of someone assessing not just recovery, but what the recovery revealed. The structural vulnerabilities in the supply chain that had made the contamination possible, the gaps in the oversight systems that had allowed unauthorized substitutions to run for months without triggering review. She wrote a full remediation report, presented it to the council not as accusation but as architecture. This is what failed. This is how it failed. This is what we build instead. Revik was reinstated in the 4th week. He stood in the council chamber with the specific posture of a man who had been given back something he'd expected to lose permanently and was still calibrating what to do with the return of it. Celine shook his hand and he looked at her with the expression of someone for whom words were insufficient and who'd decided not to insult the moment by using them anyway. She respected that. Asha Vane received formal recognition from the Northern Pack Alliance Council. Not a title, not a position, but the specific acknowledgement of the record, Her 11 years of documentation entered into the Alliance's formal archive under her real name. She sat in the back of the room when it was read, and she did not appear moved by it in any visible way, and afterward over a cup of something bitter at the same tavern table where they'd worked through that first long night, she told Celine that what she felt was mostly tired. "I know," Celine said. "Does it get easier?" Asha asked. "Not the wound part, the after part." Celine thought about it honestly. "It gets different," she said. "I'll tell you when I know if different is better." Asha considered that. "Fair," she said. The ceremony was held on the last night of winter, which was Kael's choice, and which she understood when she stood in the courtyard of Silverfang Keep under a moon that had gone from blood red at its rising to clear silver at its zenith, the specific transition of the season made visible in a single night sky. There was no formal structure to it. That had been her condition. Not a public reinvestiture, not a ceremony designed for the political optics of restoration, but something smaller and true. The pack council present, the senior captains, the elders including Marin, who stood with her arms folded and her gray braids over her shoulders, and the expression of a woman who had argued against the exile in a corridor and been overruled, and had never stopped being right. Kael stood in front of her in the courtyard. He was not wearing his formal coat. He was in the same wool and leather he'd worn at 4 a.m. war room sessions, the working clothes, which told her he had understood the instruction and honored it. He looked like himself, the most honest version of himself she had seen, carrying everything the last months had put on him without pretending the weight wasn't there, which was, in the end, the only kind of strength she had ever respected. He knelt, not on ceremony, not in the performed gesture of formal investiture. He went down on one knee in the courtyard stones with the winter wind moving his hair and his eyes level with hers and the full assembly watching, and what she read in his face was not submission, because that had never been what she wanted, not from him, not from anyone, but recognition. The specific acknowledgement of one person by another that says, "I see what this cost you, and I see what you built from it, and I am not adequate to either, but I am attempting to be honest about the gap." She stood in front of him for a moment, felt the cold of the night and the specific weight of the last months, and the presence of the people around her, the pack she had run toward in a burning fortress, the people she had chosen even when the choice was not asked for and not acknowledged, chosen because they were hers, and she was theirs, in the way that goes beyond assignment. She put her hand on his shoulder. Not elevation, not acceptance of fealty, just contact, the simple physical grammar of two people standing on the same side of something that had tried very hard to put them on opposite sides. "Get up," she said, quietly, for him alone. He stood. "You know, this doesn't mean we're finished reckoning," she said. "I know. You know the law is the law regardless of who I am to you." "I know that too." "Good." She looked at him one more moment. Then, because some things need to be said plainly, and she had done enough work in the frozen north on the difference between plainness and performance to know which was which. "I'm glad you're standing here. I want to be clear about that. I am glad you're here." Something settled in his face, the last held tension of a man who has been waiting across a winter to know if a specific thing is still true. "So am I," he said. The moon was clear and high and cold above Silverfang Keep, and the pack was alive and healing and had a law in its charter that had not existed a month ago, and the northern wilds were 300 miles behind her, and Celine Vane stood in the courtyard of the pack she had chosen and been chosen by and understood that this, the standing, the choosing, the building of something better out of the wreckage of what had been destroyed, was what it meant to survive. Not the absence of damage, not the erasure of what had been done or said or lost, but the presence of what had been built from those materials, in spite of them, because of them. The specific stubborn vitality of a person who has been through the worst available version of a thing and emerged not unscarred but unbroken. She had not forgiven easily. She was not finished forgiving. That was work that would take longer than a ceremony and longer than a winter, and possibly longer than she could currently see the end of. But she was home. She was standing. And for tonight, in the cold light of a moon going from red to silver, that was more than enough.